director, and now I provide consultation to school districts, our state department, and I also provide consultation to Family Connections of South Carolina as their special education consultant. And IEPs are something I'm very familiar with. I've written many and I've been in many, many meetings, and I often laugh and say, you know, one day I will have a full understanding of everything we do really to protect the rights of our students with disabilities. And sometimes it seems cumbersome. So today we're going to kind of work through the process. I'm going to talk about some best practices that we would like to see. We'll talk a little bit about the law. And so I'm going to see if I can share my screen right now and pull up our the presentation. Where there it is. And we will get going. If you have questions, if you want to put them in the chat, we'll try to get to those. And remembering that if you have questions specifically about something about your child, that might be something that Family Connections can connect with you to ask if it's a particular situation. If you have general questions, those will be things that we try to answer on here about the IEP process. So you're here because you know how great Family Connections is. And I just want to say, as a former school district person, couldn't have lived without our parent partners. They're so crucial to the work that we do to make sure that we have a good relationship and a collaborative relationship with each other as we deliver services for students. Today, we're going to talk about the IEP, we're going to talk about components, and we're going to talk about a few quality indicators of a well-written IEP, what you should be looking for. So I always like to start out with, why do we have an IEP? And sometimes I think we forget. Sometimes we get so caught up in the compliance part of it. Districts are trying to meet all those timelines of getting the IEPs done. And sometimes we need to just take a step back and remember that that purpose is to make sure that we are meeting those individual needs of students with disabilities. I know that sounds like, yeah, of course we are, but it's hard. It's hard work. And doing that work, and our teachers giving them the support they need to be able to do this. So we want to meet their needs. We also want to make sure that they have involvement in the general curriculum, that they are able to access the general curriculum, and that they are making progress towards their IEP goals, and also progress in the general curriculum. They may not be making the standard, but are they progressing more toward getting there? And those are things that we always want to be looking at. So the IEP includes a process. We have a written plan. And then, of course, most of all, we have those services that we deliver. And so I always like to think about those three parts of the process of getting the IEP developed, that actual written statement that we do together collaboratively. And then the most important thing is when we deliver those services and making sure they get delivered. In fact, most of the time we have problems, it's with delivery. So let's talk a little bit about the process of an IEP meeting. There's some requirements in the law. And if you look here, you'll see that I reference the law. You can actually Google the reference down here. And some of them I put a link in for you. And if you do IDEA and Google and put that reference, it will actually come up with the law where it tells you this. But when we meet, it must be collaborative between parents, school personnel, agencies, and others who have knowledge and expertise. So we can't just send out a thing and say, hey, your meeting's this day. It has to be a collaborative agreement. And that meeting must result in a plan. And so we have to come together so that we are building that plan, and that we are getting the delivery, deciding about the services that will be delivered to the student. Now, I've had some meetings that we've had to table because maybe we needed to get some more information. I've had meetings that were so long that we ran them over 2 days. Try not to do that because that never does too much good. But for the most part, that's what we're trying to do. I'm going to talk to you about if we do a good job before the meeting can be pretty quick. And so we want to try to build those things in our process. So in our IEP process, we kind of always start out with our general education standards. That's the general curriculum that we talk about. What we are hoping students will know, South Carolina is a state that has grade level standards. Not all states do that. Some of them have bands, but we have grade level standards. And so we start out with assessment. And from that assessment, we write our present levels of performance. We then determine accommodations, modifications, supplementary aids and services. And then we get our special ed services, get those goals, we deliver specially designed instruction, and then we progress monitor and report, and then we start that process all over again. And we have to do that at least annually. So the process of developing the plan is we have the IEP team selection, and I'll talk a little bit more about all those IEP team members, but we want those team members that are going to talk about not only the student, but also about the general curriculum. And that really is why that general education teacher is there, because they have knowledge of the general curriculum. And we want to make sure we have our related service providers there. So we want to get that team, and then we want to, before the meeting, gather input from everybody, including parents or agencies, or maybe we have private providers that we want to get some input about how that child's doing in that setting. But gathering that input ahead of time makes our meetings go faster. And then we want to get a written draft before the meeting, set up the meeting, and then have the meeting. There is not a requirement to give parents a draft of the IEP. I recommend that that be done and that it reflect the present levels. When I work with district teams, I say, go ahead and get the present levels. Go ahead and make a determination about goals. But actually, some of the things the team needs to meet and discuss is when we get to that LRE, how much time? Those are things we want to make those recommendations in the meeting when we're all together and looking at that student comprehensively. In South Carolina right now, we're using a system called Enrich. We are getting a new system. It will roll out beginning in January. And so we'll have some changes with that. But it will still be, we'll have the same IEP all over the state. And so more information I know will be coming about that, but we'll be talking mainly about process and not about the system. So let's talk about that written plan, that written statement, and what that needs to look like. So here's the requirements. We have to have a present level of academic achievement and functional performance, and it does have to be present. And that means current. So I always tell, when I work with school districts, I say no more than 2 months. If you're reporting something old because like maybe a standardized test, that's fine. But when you get into some of that diagnostic data, it needs to be current because students do change over time. We have to have good measurable goals. We have to report and tell you how progress is monitored and how it will be reported to you. How often and how it's going to be done, progress on those goals. We have to give a full description of special education and related services. We have to tell you the extent the child will not be in the general education classroom. And we have to have the IEP should support that. We have to describe accommodations and modifications, and then we have to have beginning and ending dates, the frequency and duration of all those services. And of course, for students who are 13 or older in our state, we have to have post-secondary goal and transition services. And so that's a whole nother training to talk about what a good transition IEP looks like. But these are the requirements that are in the law. And if you click on that, if you've gotten this presentation, you can go straight to the law that talk about the requirements. But remember that the most important thing we do is deliver services. That plan's really important, but the provision of those services is the most important thing. The requirements is that it includes many partners in delivery of services. It includes special educators, it includes general educators, it includes related service providers, which are people like occupational therapists, physical therapists. We may have some that audiologists that provide some related services. It's many partners. Every member must follow the written IEP. We are under, it is a statute that we must follow what's been written. We must deliver services that are based on peer-reviewed research. So that means that it can't just be something that we saw that has no basis. So sometimes we may have somebody that sees something and says, oh, I heard this is really good, I'm going to try it. Well, the law actually says that those services must be based on peer-reviewed research, and there is a documented evidence that it will work. We have to monitor the progress, and we should be following those high leverage practices for delivery of instruction. So those are the things that we want to make sure that we are doing when we deliver services. So I like to talk about getting ready for the meeting, prepping for the meeting. That's the most important thing we do. And I do have a lot of concerns that our teachers do not have enough time to do good prep. They are busy teaching and they don't have a lot of planning time, and it takes time. So I always say there are 4 steps. You plan the meeting, you review your existing data and get any other data that you may need to write that good present level. You're going to engage every single team member, including parents and students, if particularly those who are 13, to give input on goals and services. And then you're going to prepare the draft IEP. Excuse me, it is fall. I've got the allergies going on. So let's talk about planning the meeting. We talked a little bit about that. Parents must be notified early enough to ensure that you have the opportunity to attend. And the meeting must be scheduled at a mutually agreed on time and place. So I'm back to this mutual agreement. This is from the law. My best practice is you should be contacted before meeting invitation comes out to make sure that it's a time that you can come and get that scheduled. You have to be given notice of the meeting, written notice. That notice has to tell you the purpose of the meeting. It has to tell you the time and location. It has to tell you who will be attending. It doesn't have to give names, but you need to know the positions that will be there. There should be no surprises when you walk in the room. So if they're asking, you know, some member that's not usually on your child's team, that should be there. And then you have a right to have a representative who has knowledge and expertise about their child. This is from the law. For children who are transitioning, who are coming in from Part C, which is our BabyNet program, they can have a representative from BabyNet in that meeting, in that first meeting. So it's really important to remember, and it's always, I always tell you that it's nice to inform the school that you are bringing somebody, just the same way they have to inform you who they're having in the meeting. It's the same. It's just a nice courtesy for the school team. You have to have this in writing. I know it was really hard during COVID. We had some people that were kind of sending Google Calendar invites and maybe didn't have all the information on there. I think everybody's kind of gotten that straight now. So the planning team. Well, first of all, you and students age 13 have to be invited. They can be invited younger, but at 13, they have to be invited to the meeting in South Carolina. This is their expertise is, you know your child better than anybody. Parents know their children. Children know themselves. This is their IEP. And so particularly when children start turn 13, it's very important that they're part of this development. It should be driven by them. It's their plan. And we're trying to teach them those skills to advocate. And this is where they can learn to do that in real time. A local education administrator has to be there. That could be a school level building administrator. It could be a district level person. But what that person has to be able to do is they have to be able to commit district resources for what's needed for the child. They have to have an idea of what those resources are and to be able to commit those. The special educator brings that expertise of knowledge of disabilities and working with students with disabilities, and also they know the student generally. The general educator really brings that knowledge of the general curriculum, and they should be having data on the use of accommodations and modifications in the general classroom, how things are working in the general classroom, so that we can continue to build a good high quality IEP. But they help us a lot with understanding the needs of the general curriculum. An individual who can interpret data from evaluations. This could be a school psychologist, but many times it can be the special education teacher. I know as a special educator, I'm trying to interpret all that data as long as there's somebody there that can explain that to you and to the team. Related and supplementary service providers, they provide guidance on the services needed to support special education. Agency representatives, not at every meeting, but certainly when we start talking about transitioning students out of school, but we determine who needs to be there. I've had many different agencies represented in meetings over the years and found them very helpful because we're trying to build a cohesive program for the child. And then remember, anyone with knowledge and expertise that's going to be helping to support the student. So that's kind of the team and their roles and their expertise that they bring to the team to work together. Team members can be excused, just so you know, but you have to agree in writing for them to be excused. If that team member has something that they are going to be adding to the meeting, they have to provide that in writing. And then once again, you have to give consent in writing that that person can be excused from the meeting. This was added to the law at the last reauthorization, which is hard to believe, has been almost 20 years ago, really to expedite meetings, because sometimes you're having a meeting that you don't need every team member there, and we want to be able to excuse those team members for efficiency. And so, but just remember, parents and districts must agree to that. Parents don't have the right to say, I don't want a person at a meeting. Districts don't have the right to excuse people without parent agreement. So before the meeting, I like to say suggest items for the agenda to the team so that data can be ready. So if there are things you're concerned about, give that input, give what you know. If you're having trouble with behavior at home, maybe some things you're seeing. I've had parents sometimes say, boy, we're spending 7 hours working on homework. Well, it's from the time we get home to the time we go to bed. Share that information. We want to make sure that you want to put that on the agenda to talk about. And then if the meeting is virtual, you can prepare ahead of time. I know a lot of our schools are doing virtual meetings. This is a great little, if you click on this, it takes you to a little virtual training tip sheet that gives you some good ideas for being ready for a virtual meeting. This is the biggest thing that we do, is we need to review what data we have and make sure we have all the data that we need in a present level of performance. We have lots of data now, but sometimes it's not the right data. And so we want to make sure we get that so that we can develop a good present level of academic achievement and functional performance. So just notice that should say FP, not academic achievement and functional performance. So here's the 4 things that we need, that we have to do. That present level should give us the strengths of the students so that we can build a strengths-based IEP. That's how we make decisions about where students can participate with general ed. That's how we make decisions about how we can best remove those barriers that they're experiencing because of their disability. So we want to make sure we're putting good strengths. That shouldn't just be that they, I've read sometime that'll say, the student's nice and well behaved. That's not what we're talking about. We want to know academically what are their strengths, and also in their social competence, their functioning skills. Do they have strong executive functioning skills? We want to know those things. We want to know the personal weaknesses of the student. This is how we build the support for the student. What are those things that they need assistance in? We must have, from the present level, a good description of how the student's disability impacts their educational performance, and access to the general curriculum. This is why we're building this IEP. And if we can't give a good statement, that child may not need to be on an IEP. We should have all the evidence in the present level that lets us know this impact is so much that they must have an IEP. And then we must have data to establish a baseline for goal development and the needed services. So we want to make sure that we use multiple sources of data, and you should see this on your child's IEP. We use a lot of norm reference data. So if you're in a district and you see things like our state accountability scores that kind of tell how children are doing on the standards. A lot of schools, most of our school districts have some other kind of assessment. You may have heard of MAP or iReady or STAR. Those are assessments that let you know how your child is doing compared to peers. And those are the first things we look at, because if they're performing below their peers, then we're going to want to look at how are we going to support them and why are those barriers there. We've got to have good diagnostic data to determine the specific areas they need specially designed instruction. So we have to have more than just those norm reference scores. We're going to want to see some other scores. And then we need progress monitoring data. Whether that's a whole nother training on how to progress monitor, whether that's using a curriculum-based measurement, direct observation, but that needs to be in the present level because we need to see how they are responding to the current program. Here's some data sources. Assessment results, rating scales, grades, progress monitoring data, direct observation, student interviews, agency reports. All of these things are data sources you can use. I will remind you that grades are our least objective measure. We have a lot of things that get graded, and I'll just give you an example. Maybe you were never one of these students, but I can remember I had teachers that took 5 points off if you didn't put your name on your paper. So kids can lose credit for things or get credit for things that aren't exactly about them knowing the skills. And so while we want to look at grades, I think we want to make sure we have multiple sources of data. In your handouts, this is some tools that you can use for data consideration. This actually was suggested by David Bateman and Mitch Yell, and they did a whole journal on IEPs, and I took their recommendations and found some of the things we use in South Carolina. And this just gives you an idea of some different data sources that people might be using in these areas to write a good present level. We want parent and student input. We want to make sure that you are giving the academic and functional strengths. And I know that I have people here from, I've seen some people from DDSN. I know sometimes we have some of our students that are in foster care, and you've got a history that may not be showing up in everything. We want to know those things. We want input before the meeting. We need, particularly when we start talking about behavior and those functional needs that students have, it's really important that we have that history and that we're giving that input. What you're seeing at home may not be what's happening at school. but we got to talk about that. Why is that? And what can we do about any kind of problems that are arising? If you have private reports, certainly you need to share those. If your child's getting therapy outside of school, please share that with the school therapist. They need to see what's happening. If you've got a tutor even, and they can give a report, that's great. Any kind of medical updates you have, a lot of our children have medical issues as well. Those are important for you to send to the school, medication changes, all those things. And then, of course, I've talked about this, any observations you have at home. That's important. You know your child better than anybody else. And we need to have that as we plan. And remember, our students need to be involved in this too. They know themselves. Sometimes we give them accommodations that they don't even want, and they don't find them useful. So we want to make sure that we have talked to them and gotten input on those things. There's a lot of people will use a parent input guide. Some people do interviews. Some people have, a form they may ask you to fill out, but you should be given input. And we want this prior to the meeting. Input is not during the meeting. Do you have anything to add? So when it's getting close to time for your child's IEP meeting, it's okay for you to contact the school and say, I'd like to provide some input as you prepare for the IEP if they don't contact you. Engage team members to analyze the data. Sorry, I hit the wrong button there. And problem solve. What are we going to do? And so that's what we want a good IEP team to be doing. And the problem solving process is once we've identified those needs through a present level, we want to develop goals, and we want to determine the services the student's going to need. And this is crucial. And when this is well done and we spend time doing this well, we get a stronger IEP. So we're ready. We've got strengths. We know the needs. We know how the child's disability impacts, and we've got data to establish some baseline goals. One of the things that you need to provide input on is accommodations and modifications. You may suggest some things for goals that you would like for your child to work on. And then if you think services are needed or more services, those are things that you can give input. Remember, input doesn't mean the team's going to determine that that's appropriate. This is giving it ahead of time so that we can talk about it and look at it. And then the IEP is drafted by generally the special education teacher. They write the present level of performance. And so our present level of academic achievement and functional performance in South Carolina, we have several parts. The first part says, what are the students' academic and functional strengths? So here's a quick check that I use to say, yeah, this is good. Does each area describe strengths relative to peers? There should be something that shows that there is a comparison. It's not unlike when I go to the doctor and have to, unfortunately, as I've aged, I've had to start taking blood pressure medicine. There is a norm, and I'm above that norm. So in that case, I have to take some medication. There should be something that shows you that. Are the data current? And do they have data that even supports their strengths, both academically and functionally? Do the strengths support placement in general education? So children aren't just in general education classrooms because we have a full inclusion model or because they're supposed to be included. They have to be able to benefit from being there. And we want them to be in those areas where they benefit from being there and can learn. And the barriers of their disability don't prevent them from learning. We can give them accommodations so they're successful. Do they have some multiple sources of data, and do the strength support strategies to develop their IEP? Do I know what they're good at so that I know how to build that IEP? What are the students' academic and functional needs? That's the second question that we look at. And so once again, you're describing their needs relative to peers. So when a teacher puts some kind of score down, let's just say, I'll just give one. If they say the score is a 15, what does that mean? They should be describing what the norm range would be. And so that you have a clear picture of how discrepant that is. And I want more than one measure to probably describe that. And then we've got that question, that impact question. Here's a good, just little guiding thing. Does it clearly define why we're giving this child the services they're getting? Sometimes we keep students in special education too long. We think we're protecting them, and maybe they don't need all those services. And so we want to make sure that we're really clearly looking at the need. And then, of course, have you given meaningful input? What is your input on this? It doesn't have to be written on that line. A lot of places I tell teachers, you can include that in the narrative at the top. You don't have to write it twice. You just have to make sure you have it. In our state, we then go into specific findings. And so once we've done that, I always say that first part that we just went over, those 4 questions, that's just our big general overview. And then we're going to those areas of need, we're going to give more specific findings. This is where we get into more of our diagnostic data. And so we'll name the area: reading, math, writing, behavior, communication. There's a, whatever the area is that is a weakness that we're going to provide services for. We're going to give the assessment tools that we've used. So as a teacher, I might have used curriculum-based measurement. I might be using my curriculum has assessments within it that I'm giving, and I may be doing some direct observation of the student. And so I may have 2 or 3 things. The assessment that we use for this part, this diagnostic part, should be no older than 2 to 3 months. And I would say 3, stretching it in my opinion. And it should provide very specific diagnostic information about the student. So if I'm working with a child with beginning literacy, I may have some data that shows that of the 44 phonemes, they know 20 of them, and I know which ones they don't know. So those are the kinds of things I'm gonna know where that breakdown is. And then I'm gonna want to have that baseline data to develop my goal for whatever I'm doing. And that's a training in and of itself, writing goals. So what does IDEA say about those services? I said this a little bit earlier, but you'll probably hear me say it 4 times before we get off today. Has to be based on peer-reviewed research. That means that experts have reviewed what we're using and found that it works with the population that we are serving. And then our whole thing is that we are getting those services so that the student can advance appropriately towards attaining their annual goals. They can be involved and make progress in the general curriculum. Doesn't say we're going to catch them all up, but they are going to be able to make progress. And then that they're able to be educated and participate with children with disabilities and non-disabled children in the activities. So our services should allow all of that. I always like to tell people, let's start with the least intrusive and go to the most intrusive. So I like for teams to kind of talk about, that's a barrier the student has. Can we meet that with an accommodation? We have a lot of students that get put in self-contained programs all day because of their reading level. Well, do we need to pull them? Can we accommodate reading in other classes through our assistive technology that we have, and then have special education services just for reading? Or behavior, do we really have a good support plan in place for them? So we always want to start there because that's the least intrusive. And then what modifications can we make to the general curriculum so that the child can be successful? And then what will need specially designed instruction. And then we determine the related services that are needed to support special education. So children don't get related services unless they need it to benefit from their special education, not their general education, but their special education. And that's what the law tells us about those related services. We've had students before that, somebody said, well, they need occupational therapy, but they don't need special education. If they don't have a disability, then that doesn't fall under that law. And so sometimes that's a little confusing. They may need some occupational therapy, but it may not be school-based. So we've decided on all those accommodations and modifications and supplementary services. I want to talk a little bit more about that. We talked a little bit about the strengths and why we want to make sure that we've got those strengths. So notice I'm kind of coming back around because you're going to do, this is what happens as you're developing the IEP. We've given input on them. We've written them up. And now we want to select those accommodations and modifications that are going to benefit that child. So I give the example all the time that a lot of times you'll have people do auditory or oral for a student. Well, that child has to have really strong listening comprehension skills to be able to benefit from that accommodation. If we just simply put that on there and they don't have good listening comprehension, that's not an effective accommodation for them. We may have to find something else. I've seen many students with poor listening comprehension. We know that, and they have auditory, oral and auditory. So that's not a good match. So just thinking about that, the strengths are what we use to determine the accommodations. When we think about this whole piece of supplementary aids and services that you see on the IEP, this is provided in general education or any other education related settings. And this is what enables the student to be educated with their non-disabled peers. They can be provided to the student or on behalf of a student. They don't have to be direct services to the student. And I put some examples down here, but these are not all of them. And that is, educational interpreting a lot of times that we have for our students who with hearing impairments. Maybe a child might need adult supervision during transition times in the hallway. We don't have to do note taking too much, but we may have someone that is giving a copy of their notes to a student. Assistive technology services are certainly enabling our students to benefit from being in general education. And then of course, training for general educators, training for school teams. I find a lot of times we put assistive technology in place and then we don't put the training piece in place to train everybody how to use the assistive technology. So those things need to be described in the IEP. Those supplementary aids and services. And then, of course, we have accommodations. And I will tell you that we tend to over accommodate, and more is not better. We want to make sure our accommodations are meaningful and benefit the child, but also that they're doable for the child and for the classroom. So remember, accommodations don't change what the child has to do. They just remove the barriers. They still have to show what they know. They still have to participate. It doesn't reduce what they have to know. It may change the way they let you know what they have to know. And so we say there's several accommodations. Certainly setting is one of them. We may have a certain place in the classroom where they sit. We may provide instruction a certain way. Through presentation, we may ask teachers to do certain things. Those may be accommodations. We may let students respond in a different way, and then scheduling. Instructional accommodations need to be in place to have them for assessment. And so we want to make sure we use those things in what we do for students, and that they're beneficial. Um, the present level should support the accommodations we give. So sometimes when, you might take a laundry list of accommodations I've seen this happen sometimes from a private evaluation, they give, a million accommodations. That's not how you make decisions for accommodations. We want to really look at what the child can use, what they're willing to use, because sometimes they're not willing to use some of them, and what's the least we can do to remove that barrier. Guiding questions for selecting, or what does the child regularly use? I always want to ask kids, what helps you? They know, they can tell you what helps them. What do they think about it? And we want to have some evidence that they've been willing to use it. And we want to get what works. I always like to get input from that gen ed teacher. Are they using this? Sometimes you'll see things of extended time and the teacher says they never use it. And so if they're not using it, we don't leave it on there. Maybe they don't need it. Maybe they need it. And the teacher says, I'm always having to give them more time. That might be something we might want to add. Teachers can give us lots of great information. The law actually talks about accommodation specifically when it talks about testing. And it's interesting because this is really where we see it. And that we have to put the accommodations the child will use in testing. There are some accommodations that are not allowed for the test. And so a lot of times you'll have the school telling you, like I know, for example, the third grade reading for our South Carolina SC Ready, students cannot have that read to them. That's not an allowable accommodation. And so there's some accommodations that aren't allowed that we might be using in daily instruction. They don't have to match exactly. And sometimes you'll hear people say, we can't do it on the test, so we're not going to do it in the classroom. That's not accurate. We could use them, but you have to understand the child won't have them for the testing. The other piece of that is if they're not doing it all the time, you don't do it on test day. That's very concerning to kids. The one I see the most abuse with is small group testing. That child's not going out to small group testing all the time. It's probably not a good accommodation. On the biggest, assessment day, all of a sudden they're pulled in a small group. They don't know the person administering the test. They don't know the other kids in the room. Sometimes that's more anxiety than being in the general classroom. So those are discussions you have with your IEP team. And I got ahead of myself about the instructional accommodations. I also want to remind you, if you've got high school students that are taking ACT, SAT, any of those assessments, those decisions cannot be made by an IEP team. That paperwork has to go into the testing board and they approve accommodations. And that's why one of the things we're really starting to say is don't over accommodate. Because then if those students have had that all along and then the ACT or SAT says no, then that student is, that's problematic for the student. So we want to give them what they need, but not too much. This is a great document that talks about accessibility, that talks about guidance for teams to consider when they're making decisions about accommodations. Just some must-haves. Kids have to be taught to use the accommodation. It has to be implemented in classroom instruction, and we must know that it's effective. If we say a child's going to use, maybe speech to text, so they're going to dictate their writing prompt, we got to make sure that it is effective in doing its job, because remember, accommodations move the barrier so that kids can show what they know. Modifications change what the students expected to learn. And so sometimes you'll have students, those expectations are prioritized. Maybe they're not covering all the standards and we've agreed on which ones. Sometimes, and I just gave them an example, sometimes they can be in the general education classroom, but we're going to modify it and they're going to be given a modified grade. It's really hard a lot of times for our gen ed partners to do this, but if we clearly define it in the IEP, we can do it. Modifications can be made, but the district has to determine if that modification is allowable for the student to earn a credit, particularly when we get in high school in those credit-bearing classes. General educators have to provide input on this. They know the standards there. That's their content area. Special educators don't generally have that content knowledge. So that's why we depend on them. Sometimes they might, but a lot of times they don't. You would not want me to know the chemistry standards because that would not be my thing. Once again, we want to know the data on effectiveness, and then what are the perceptions in the classroom. Sometimes we modify curriculum in the classroom and the child is doing something so different that that's not really, that it may not be good for that student in the classroom. So those are discussions we want to have with the team. And then of course, there is testing for our students who have a significant modification to their program. That's 1% of our students that are tested through an alternate assessment. And I won't get into that, but they take a different assessment than the rest of the students take. So once we've got that support, we've looked at accommodations and modifications, we've decided we want to get our specially designed instruction in place with goals. Remember, goals must be measurable and developed for all areas needing special education or related services if it's a goal related service. Transportation is not, so that would be an example where they don't. And the goals should be based on the skills the student needs to access and progress in the general curriculum. We don't have to have multiple goals. We may have one goal for fine motor that's being covered by the special education teacher and the occupational therapist. They don't each have to have a goal, but we have to have a goal to address the area and talk about who's going to work to support the goal. I am all about having multiple providers working on the same goal because we're going to get more done. Students who are participating in alternate assessment must have objectives. Other students can have them, but those who are in alternate assessment must have them. So remember, goals have to target a student outcome. They have to give the condition. They have to be observable. I always tell people, and measurable. I have to be able to see and count it. So when you write a goal, can I see the student doing it? Can I count it? And it has to be attainable in a 12-month period of time. Just did a couple of examples and non-examples. Here's an example. Samantha will increase time on task during a class activity or assignment. It's observable. From 3 minutes to 15-minute intervals. I can measure that and take data on it in all academic classes. That gives my condition for it. I'm expecting this across all of our academic classes. I would collect data on that. Samantha will finish classwork by completing 80% of the following objectives is not. Here's another one. Given a 7th grade passage, that's my condition. The student will improve skills in reading by increasing fluency. That's observable from 100 words per minute to 140 words per minute with 90% accuracy measurable on story retell. So that gives another condition. So that's our whole reading there. So those are very measurable things that you can report on. And that's what I'm looking at is how will I report on that data? Here's an example of a student that has objectives. The student will use voice output device to indicate basic requests for assistance 100% of the time. And this kind of walks through the steps till they get there. And so they may just be working on the first objective when they first start getting progress notes. That's just an example of what a good goal might look like. This would be a non-example. That they'll complete 80% of the following objectives, and it doesn't give me anything to countermeasure. And I don't know how I would collect data on that. So I always remind you that I like for when I work with school teams, I always say you should have your data collection sheet or process right there when you go over the goals. Here's how I'm going to collect the data on that. Then we have our specially designed instruction. That should be described in the IEP. What type of service is it? Who's going to provide it? Is it a direct to the student or indirect service? So sometimes I had students that I was actually doing consultation with the teacher to help adapt curriculum. That's an indirect service. The direct service is when I'm providing specially designed instruction. Where is this service going to be provided? And is this something we're going to consider for extended school year? We'll talk a little bit more about extended school year a little bit later in this presentation. The schedule of this service, and there should be a full description of what the service will look like. Special education means specially designed instruction provided to the student to meet their unique needs. It's got to be different. And when we're thinking about that specially designed instruction, how much time will it take to ensure the goal is reached? And how much direct or indirect service? Sometimes we see students that are not progressing, and we may need to up their specially designed instruction because we need to intensify what we're doing with that student. And that's what special education is. Here's a list of possible related services. Certainly this is not exhaustive, but remember, it enables the student to benefit from special education, and we have to determine that. Related services, this is straight from the law. Some related services that does not include any medical device that is surgically implanted. So schools aren't responsible for that. And then some related services require minutes, some do not. That's a determination. Like I said, transportation is not. Training doesn't require minutes. Sometimes people put minutes, but it's not a requirement. You'll see on the IEP clearly define those direct services. Direct services always require minutes. Indirect services do not. Except transportation is a direct service. Transportation is the one that gets us all the time. So setting and schedule, this is the other part that you will see. The setting is inside the general education classroom or outside the general education classroom. Where will they get the services? And then what is the schedule? What does it look like? The date the service starts and the minutes. The school does not have to tell you time of day, and they do not have to give at the time of day that you might request. They have to schedule that within their working day. So there's certainly things you can discuss, but you're not required to do that. Some things are delivered independently and some are co-delivered. So you might have an occupational and physical therapist working with the special education teacher all at once. I'm a big fan of that because then we're all working together and we know what each other's doing. It's a great thing if we can get that going for a lot of our students, not all of them. But that should be described. And then you should have a good written description. So this is just one that, this is just an example that you can see. I won't read the whole thing to you. You can have this presentation, but you can see that it's pretty clear. IMA will receive explicit instruction in reading in small group for 90 minutes per day, 3 days a week, and 60 minutes, 2 days a week. If I get down to assistive technology, the assistive technology specialist will provide direct instruction to IMA individually on the use of her speech system. And another thing, an indirect service, they're going to ensure that all the digital materials are accessible and provide training. You can see I've got another piece down here. The student's getting some behavior, and I can see what kinds of services are being given and how often. This is really important, this description part, because the rest of them are check boxes and they don't really tell you exactly what it looks like. This is the part that tells you exactly what it looks like. So I like to see this part to be robust for our students. so that I'm clear about what's being provided. Progress monitoring. You should know how that child's going to be progress monitoring. How are they going to collect that data? What will it look like? And how often will it be done and reported to you? It's not a requirement. We kind of have gotten what the law suggests is kind of interesting. I just went back and reread this not too long ago. Is they give the example is that it should be at least as often as general education students, but it could be more. That's not actually in stone. So schools have to decide. I always tell people that quarterly works because we generally say when we're intervening with students, 8 to 9 weeks is a good time to see whether what we're doing is working. And so looking at that progress at those places to make some decisions is important. So we have this robust draft. We've got it ready to roll, and we want to have an efficient meeting. You can see how if we spend time up front getting all that data, getting it ready, all the team members having time to look at it, we can have a pretty quick meeting. So during that meeting, you're going to review the present levels just to make sure everybody understands. We're going to make sure our goals are set and have a progress monitoring plan. And then we're, going to review the services we recommended. The things that we want to talk about during the meeting, I recommend, this is just my recommendation, is the least restrictive environment. I think it's very important to have that discussion during the meeting. Extended school year, just kind of knowing what we'll need to cover during the extended school year. And then any of the considerations, which I'll talk about.
Dr. Thomas, I hate to interrupt you. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and I didn't know if you wanted to pause now and address some of them. One of them I'll go ahead and just address. Yes, you all will get a copy of the presentation. If you did not receive it, if you'll put your email in the chat, I'll make sure that you do. But there are a couple questions. Let me know if you can't see them, or I can read through them.
Pulling them up. Let's see if I can go back here. So any of the personal things about, like I see this comment here about a student needing a personal assistant. Those are team decisions, and they should show data for that. But if it's a medical thing, then we would want to look at medical data for that. And a lot of times we'll involve school nurses in those meetings. So those are, I think we have to be careful about having adults with students, because that is a very, it's not a placement, but it is a very restrictive thing. And so it's not, we want to make sure that if there was some reason for safety or those kinds of things, and most districts do have some procedures for that. Somebody asked, where should the narrative portion be on the IEP in regards to the time frame of services? There is a section to give a description and enrich, to write that out. So there's a place where it's just on the form, and then there's a place you can write out. If a student transfers to homeschool, can they keep their IEP and use services? So that's a whole different question. Once a child is homeschooled, they no longer have an individual right to an IEP. They go on what's called the service plan. And that is a different process when they go into a homeschool setting. And that's something that we can give you some more information on. How often should the resource teacher be sending home reports? Whatever it says on the IEP. What most people do is they really do it at the same time we report progress for general education. That's been my experience. Don't know if that, but the requirement is that if whatever they put, that has to be stated in the IEP, that they're going to give it to you every 9 weeks, that they're going to give it to you every 6 weeks, whatever they say. I've got a question, one more question here that I skipped earlier, is about graduating and high school diplomas. I don't, there's one time, but when the child's 13, we start looking at, are they going to get a diploma or are they on certificate track? There's nothing in writing that says we don't change that as we go through. And we certainly don't make a decision about placement and services for students early based on, well, if we do this, they won't get a diploma, because that's just not true. Every child it's an individual decision, and we really do have to work on that when we start to looking at modifications. Or, I've heard a few people saying, well, we don't want to put, we don't want to put them in this class. They'll never be able to get a diploma and they're 7 years old. Well, what we want is for younger children to get all the skills they can get so that they can be more successful later. So it just depends. And I always say this, it depends on the student. If the student transfers back in the public school from homeschooling, will they get their IEP back? Yes, if they're still eligible. So what I will tell you, if the child is being homeschooled, make sure you're keeping up with reevaluations. So they have to be reevaluated every 3 years by law to determine eligibility. I always tell people, whether your child's in private school or being homeschooled, keep up with that reevaluation. You are entitled to that under the law. That is one thing. When do we know if they are diploma tracked or not? They have to tell you they have to start talking about it at 13. But during their post-secondary. That's whether they're being whether they're going to be on a certificate. We will do a thing on transition, and that'll be something we'll talk a little bit more about in the transition training. So I want to talk about least restrictive environment. That means that students are educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent possible. But there has to be benefit from being in that general education classroom. They have to be able to benefit from being there and show progress. So sometimes we have students that are in general ed classrooms and they are not benefited because they can't even access the curriculum. So that might be a time when we decide that's not the appropriate placement. Sometimes we think, and just because we had a question about the personal assistant, that a personal assistant is the person. That's not always true. Just because we put them there, maybe they're keeping them in the classroom, and helping them. But if they're enabling them, that's actually detrimental to the child. So those are discussions we want to have. And I'm always careful about this because it does depend on the student. We have to be, it depends on their needs. So don't go out of here saying, gosh, she said that. No, we have to look at every student individually to look at their needs and make sure that it's for the right reasons and that they're able to benefit from being in general education and that they can, because if you look, removal from general ed occurs if the nature and severity of the disability prevents the student from achieving satisfactory with those supplementary aids and services. So they still have to be able to do it, and we want to make sure they can. And it's hard. Those are hard decisions, and sometimes we try things and then go, whoo, we got to pull this back in or add this service. That's the beauty of the IEP process, is that we can do that. Get back down here. There are a continuum of placements. I'd like to remind everyone that's still in the law. Everything from, the homeschool where they attend to, home-based where we're sending somebody into the home. IEP teams have to make those decisions. What you can't hear a school say, what would not be legal, is if they say, we are a full inclusion school and we don't do any pull-out programs, or we do only pull-out programs, or we do only when it's not an individual decision. That is where we have problems. And so those are things that are not beneficial to a student. I'm going to go back to this question that talks about accommodations and modifications. No, they are provided for general education as well. And if I said that, I'm sorry. And then there's another thing in there that does a medical disability diagnosis guarantee special education? Not necessarily, but it can. If it's impacting the child's special education, a lot of times we have medical diagnoses that come under other health impairments that are doing that. Where can one find the SC general education curriculum for each grade? So it's the standards, and that's not a curriculum, but our standards are considered what we measure. And so the standards show what kids should know and be able to do. And we actually are getting new English language arts standards starting next year. They'll be implemented next year. And I think math follows the next year. Those are on the State Department website. And you can just go to South Carolina State Department of Education and Google standards, and you'll see all the standards for all the different courses. And so teachers teach and schools buy curriculums to support the standards. All righty. And then I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but the continuum for preschool is a little bit different because they can be in a regular early childhood program or in another location to receive services. And sometimes they are in a very restrictive environment. Where will the child receive core content instruction? This is a question on our current IEP. It is not a requirement in the law. And I sometimes have a little bit of problem with this because sometimes kids need a little bit more and sometimes they need a little bit less. But it's regular instruction in the general education classroom, co-teaching with general and special education teachers in the general education classroom, specially designed instruction that supplements instruction in the general education classroom, and specially designed instruction that supplants instruction in the general education classroom. They give those 4 options. The reason I say that sometimes that's a little murky is here, having been a co-teacher, sometimes there were times during that school year that I was in the classroom providing instruction with the general education teacher, but I also had to pull that student too because of the skills. And sometimes, so, you know, we want to be fluid and flexible in our delivery. And that's where sometimes we have to do more, just depending on the student's needs. Remembering that when we're supplanting instruction, that might mean that I might make a determination that I'm going to provide the reading instruction to the student as a special educator because I'm going to really intensify so that I can get them reading. That was my strategy with young students, is that I was trying to get them reading because the older they get, the bigger the gap gets. So if we can get them reading, provide that good quality instruction early, and we know the research supports this, what they need that's specially designed for them, our chances are greater to increase their reading skills. And so it does depend on the child. I'm going to go back to that. It depends on the child. So we will, this is just part of our South Carolina IEP. We do have to give the reason the child's being removed. There is a statement that has to go on the IEP. So if the child's reading is so discrepant, we may be providing specially designed reading instruction and supplanting it. And so for every removal, we want to talk about why that is, what disability means that we need to give them more intensive services. A couple of more things, and then I'll go back and catch some of those questions. Extended school year. The IEP team makes the decision about extended school year. You should not get a notice that says the child's not eligible unless it's been discussed in the meeting. The IEP team makes the decision. It's generally made prior to the end of the school year because we're kind of looking at how the child's doing. The guidance from our State Department, and this is not in the law, kind of revolves around concern that regression would occur without ESY. It could be that the student's at a very critical point of instruction. I give the example one time that we had a student that was getting ready. He had just gotten out on a job with the job coach. I mean, we probably hadn't had him out 3 weeks and it was summer. Well, you don't want to remove that. He's just finally gotten successful out. And so, we did some extended school year for that because he was at a critical point for his IEP. The nature and severity of the disability and the services are crucial for the student's self-sufficiency, behavior support, or transition. Certainly, if a child's getting mental health counseling, we might want to consider that, during those summer months. And it just depends on the student once again, but the IEP team does make the decision. And then the next section is own assessment. And you need to know all the assessments your child will be taking and the accommodations that they will be given. If they don't participate in something, then they do need to state why they're not participating. There are some district assessments that sometimes are not accessible. And so, but you need to be told that. Post-secondary transition, just that's as I said, another whole training, but remember age 13, I've said that several times. And remember the age of majority for students must be addressed at age 17 because they will turn 18. At 18, the rights go to the student. And there's some things that parents can do that we discuss in the transition training, but they make their decisions. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about behavior intervention plans. I hate that they're not just embedded into our IEP, but they were an add-on to the law later, the special education, the IDEA. But we really do have to consider a behavior plan. When a child's behavior impedes the child's learning or that of others, then we need to consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports and other strategies to address that behavior. And that's straight from the law. That's the consideration part of the law. And so when we start thinking about the behaviors impeding their learning, so I always tell, in our district, we kind of had a rule that, boy, if we're starting to get multiple suspended days, that's impeding their learning if they're not at school. And so we don't want to wait to address that. We want to go ahead and meet and do a good functional behavior assessment, look at where the child is instructionally. And once again, that's a whole nother training to make sure. You'll notice at the beginning of our South Carolina IEP, it starts with consideration of special factors. I always train people that this should be done at the end of the IEP meeting as a checklist, because we haven't even reviewed the present levels and we're already talking about the considerations. This part was added in the law later. And so the team has to make sure that they have a behavior plan for students whose behavior is impeding their learning. And it says, do they exhibit behavior that requires a functional behavior assessment? Well, there's no other way to write a behavior plan unless you do a functional behavior assessment. And so if we're thinking that their behavior is impeding their learning, then we're going to want to go into that functional behavior assessment, behavior intervention planning, if it's that significant. That's the evidence-based practice. The law doesn't say you have to, but that is the evidence-based practice. Do they have a limited English proficiency that we need to make sure those services are there, blind or visually impaired? It's a checklist. The law does not require that this be in the written statement. It says that IEP teams have to consider these things. Our state put it in writing, but there is no requirement that it be in writing according to IDEA. But IEP teams do have to consider all these things when they're addressing student needs. What about signatures on the IEP? The law doesn't require signature. You're not agreeing to the IEP. You're actually, when you sign it, agreeing that you came to the meeting and you understand it. One, and the other is verification that you received your procedural safeguards. So a lot of times they'll ask you to sign that you've gotten your safeguards and you participated in the meeting, but it's not required. It's not an agreement. If you are in disagreement, then there's a process for you to disagree with the team, with the final consensus that the team came up with. After the meeting, you should receive a copy of the IEP and a prior written notice. The IEP cannot be implemented until you receive the prior written notice. And so that's really important that either they give it to you that day, but they can't start the IEP the next day if they're not going to get the prior written notice to you. And there's on the prior written notice, and I've given you a handout about prior written notice to go along. They have to tell you everything they proposed or anything they refused. So if you ask, somebody said something about asking for a personal assistant, if the team refused it, they have to state that they refused it. They have to tell you why they refused it. They have to tell you the data that they used to support that. And that has to be written in prior written notice. That is your document that you use to take those next steps if you have concerns. So I have lots of references that I use. And so I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'll see if I can pull up the chat and see. We had a couple of questions. Somebody had, it's been 3 weeks from a meeting. We still haven't gotten a PWN. Well, have they implemented the IEP? Can implement the IEP? Believe I guess I would call and find out why. And I will say this, and it's life is tough right now in our schools with how shorthanded they are. And so, but the law is still there. And so we've got to try to, sometimes just send those reminders and everything. No response. Well, it might not be good. And remember, if you haven't heard anything from the teacher, you might want to check with the special education director and see if you can find out what's going on. What are the steps to take if you disagree with the IEP? Well, there are several steps you can take, and that's something that one is certainly you can follow due process, and I know that or the other thing you can do is get some support and do call another meeting if you feel like you want to call another meeting and have a discussion. I always like to try that, but there's several avenues once that's happened. One thing that I think a lot of parents are getting a lot of support from is facilitated IEP meetings. And the State Department has facilitators that will come in and help with that. Sometimes that's okay. That's an avenue that you can go. Certainly, if you've been in a meeting, you're not really pleased with IEP, Family Connections is there to help you navigate that system. And that's a really important piece. All right, let me see. Did I miss anything? I think I got all those. Any other? All right. Any other questions here? And I know sometimes in the chat it's a little bit hard, but
I'm looking through to see if we have any others. I have put in the chat a couple of additional links and information. So just a reminder that we do have upcoming trainings listed on our training calendar that folks might find useful. And then if there's anything else from today's training that comes up and you have a question, the best number to contact us, as Dr. Thomas has shared here at Family Connection, is that 1-800 number. So if you're unable to see the chat, I'll go ahead and give you that number. That's 1-800-578 8750, and that's staffed by our team members here at Family Connection. So we can help you kind of identify some additional resources.
And I'm also glad to, if once you contact that number, if it's something I need to answer, they'll get in touch with me to provide that. We do have one other question. I just want to clarify, once your child is homeschooled, they are no longer eligible for an IEP. They could be eligible for an individual service plan. Homeschool students and private school students are the same, you know, kind of treated the same. And so the way that's determined is the school has to meet with homeschool and private school reps, and they kind of decide it's a proportionate share of money. So the district doesn't get an individual entitlement per pupil. And so the district may say, you know, we're going to provide speech services because that's what everybody says they wanted and agreed upon. And so if your child needs speech, they might be able to access speech through an individual service plan. And so what you'll need to ask your school about is the individual service plan, and you'll want to contact your special ed office about that. How do you request an evaluation for a child? My advice to everyone is to write a letter and send it to the special education director for the school district. And that assures that it gets in the right hands. And you write a letter and request the evaluation.
Dr. Thomas, I cannot thank you enough for today's session. It's been very, very helpful and informative. I know that we're at time, and I also want to let folks know that we will be posting the recording of this training, so it will be available. We'll check back next week, and just the materials will be shared with you. Again, if you did not get the email, just drop your email in the chat. You know how to reach us if you have additional questions. And again, thank you to Dr. Thomas for being on and presenting. Thank you all for joining us. Please fill out the survey evaluation that you'll get at the end of this training. Give us your feedback. Let us know what would be helpful for future training. So thanks, everyone. I look forward to seeing you on one of our next virtual sessions.
Thanks. Y'all take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.